Hello and welcome to this episode of Audio Notes. I'm Elad Cohen. Today I'm going to be covering the urinary and renal system. This is first year anatomy for paramedical students. So physiotherapies, I'm studying physiotherapy. So physiotherapists, sports physiologists, OTs, AP and IB students may find this useful. And yeah, if you're a medical student, this might not have enough detail for you, but here we go. So the first things first, we're going to talk about the major structures. I'm going to be going over the hormones, some special cells and structures, and some enzymes that you need to know for the urinary and / renal system. Let's talk about what this consists of. So the renal system consists of the kidneys, the ureters, which are the tubes that carry urine from the kidney to the bladder. I'll be going into those in more detail. The urinary bladder, and that's about it. And the function of this system is to get rid of waste, certain types of waste product, not solid waste. I'm talking about dissolved urea mainly, a certain amount of excess water, and to keep our salts in check. This also keeps blood volume and pressure in check by getting rid of those excess fluids, and helps to regulate blood pH by getting rid of urea, which forms uric acid. Also, the term urination is also equivalent to micturition, voiding, which I think sounds a lot better, and uresis, and also rarely immixtion, and is usually a voluntary process in mature human beings. The other term which I'm going to need you all to know before we get started is parenchyma. Parenchyma is functional tissue. So you also can use this when talking about trees. Parenchyma of a tree is the living tissue, but when I'm talking about this, it's the functional tissue of a particular organ. And let's get into the main structures. So, first we've got the kidney. The function of the kidney is to filter the blood supply and control the amount of electrolyte salts in the blood. It also filters urea and ammonium from protein digestion. So, get rid of urea and ammonia. Those are toxic in large quantities in the body. It also handles reabsorption of water, glucose, and amino acids. The kidneys are located, in terms of surface anatomy, if you are looking at the back, and you feel right above the ilium, right above the hip bones, that's more or less where the kidneys are at. The kidneys are not actually that big of an organ. They're located at between T12 and L2 for those of you who are familiar with spinal anatomy. T12 is the end of your thoracic section of your spine, and L2 is just the beginning of the lumbar spine. The term renal refers to anything related to the kidney, and the kidney is surrounded by the renal capsule. The renal capsule is a tough layer of fibrous tissue that helps to protect them from shock. If your kidneys get damaged, you're not in good shape. The arcuate arteries supply the kidney itself, and those are located at the border of the renal cortex and medulla. Some other parts you need to be familiar with of the kidney in terms of anatomy, sort of structural anatomy. We've got the cortex. The renal cortex is the outer portion of the kidney. We've got the medulla, which is the inner portion of the kidney. So the cortex is between the medulla and the capsule, or rather the cortex is deep to the capsule and is superficial to the medulla. The pyramids are sections of the renal medulla that contain nephrons. Nephrons are the filtering unit of the kidney. I'm going to get into those in more detail. You also need to know about something called the columns of Bertini. Columns of Bertini are extensions of the renal cortex in between the pyramids. And those anchor the cortex to the kidney itself. They contain blood vessels and urinary tubes, which eventually feed into the ureters. Papilla empty urine from the pyramids into the minor calyx. I will be getting into some detail about the minor calyx and the major calyx later on. And the papillary ducts receive renal filtrate. Renal filtrate is what precedes urine from medullary collecting ducts. And the medulla itself is the interglomeruli. Glomeruli are the sort of masses of capillaries that the kidney filters blood from, and the medulla is the supporting tissue of that. Let's see some more parts and terminology. We have the renal fascia, that is the layer of tissue that surrounds the kidney, and the suprarenal glands. Your suprarenal glands, if you'll remember from the endocrine system, are your adrenals. And in order, the renal fascia goes adipose on the outside, the adipose capsule, also called the perineal fat, the renal capsule, and the renal parenchyma. Remember that parenchyma is functional tissue, so the renal parenchyma is the part that actually is doing the work. The renal hilum is the invagination. Invagination is sort of a dip where the nerves and blood enter and exit the kidney. The renal sinus is the cavity contained by the renal pelvis, renal calyxes, and blood vessels. Contains blood vessels, nerves, and fat. The renal calyx, which we just mentioned, are chambers that urine passes through. So the minor calyxes surround the renal pyramids. They converge to form the major calyx before the urine passes through the renal pelvis to the ureter. I highly advise looking at Netter's or another quality anatomy atlas to get a sense of where all that is. If you are watching this on YouTube, I will try to provide a picture of some kind, potentially a dissection photo, if I can find one. Let's get into the actual filtering structures of the kidney, the nephron itself. So the nephron is the primary structural and functional unit of the kidney. It works to regulate blood volume, blood pH, electrolyte concentration, and deals with amino acid concentration in the blood and helps to get rid of a certain amount of waste protein. In a human kidney, there are anywhere from 800,000 to 1.5 million nephrons. This should give you an idea of about how thin they are. And the functions of nephrons are regulated by the endocrine system. I went over the endocrine system in episode 1. There are two kinds of nephrons. There are juxtamedullary, meaning nephrons that are close to the medulla, and cortical, meaning nephrons that are in the cortex of the kidney. Juxtamedullary nephrons make up about 15 to 20% of the nephrons, and cortical nephrons make up anywhere from 80 to 85%. So the parts of the nephron that you're going to need to be familiar with are the afferent arteriole, where blood comes in to be filtered, the glomeruli, where the glomerular capillaries, more specifically, where the blood is filtered into the Bowman's capsule, which is a sort of three-dimensional kind of hand-shaped structure that grafts the glomeruli capillaries to pull out filtrate. The efferent arteriole, where blood goes out, and the peritubular capillaries, where a certain amount of substance is reabsorbed before it is shot out into the renal vein, which feeds back to the body. The Bowman's capsule I will go over in more detail along with the peritubular capillaries. So nephron is your afferent arteriole, glomerular capillaries, efferent arteriole, and peritubular capillaries, and the Bowman's capsule is what wraps around the glomerulus. Everybody got that straight? Let's talk about the glomerular capillaries in a little bit more detail. The glomerular capillaries, as we said, are enveloped by the Bowman's capsule. Approximately 1/5 of all blood plasma passes through the glomerular wall into the capsule. Okay, so filtration results in glomerular filtrate, and the glomerular filtrate goes to the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule together are called a renal corpuscle. Corpuscle. I apologize for that. Corpuscle. And podocytes, which are a type of cell of the Bowman's capsule, wrap around the glomerular capillaries. Mesangial cells, also known as the mesangium, is a modified smooth muscle tissue supporting structure around the capillaries that contract to regulate filtration activity. When they contract, there is less activity. These also make cytokines and secrete prostaglandin and extracellular matrix. There's a sort of microanatomical term here, which is the vascular pole, okay, versus the urinary pole. The vascular pole is where your blood supply is. The urinary pole is where urine is. So when you cross from the glomerulus to the Bowman's capsule, you are going from the vascular pole to the urinary pole. The efferent arterioles, remember those are the ones going away from the glomerulus, are smaller than the afferent arterioles. What this does is it increases hydrostatic pressure, and the peritubular capillaries reabsorb most of the wanted materials, so salts and sugars, a certain amount of protein, and feed that into the renal vein. Yeah, so from the glomerulus, we've got the glomerular filtrate, which then becomes tubular fluid. Tubular fluid feeds into the convoluted tubules and the loop of Henle, which I will get into right now. The renal tubule is where things go for reabsorption and sorting, essentially. So we've got our first component, which is the proximal convoluted tubule. I may refer to this as PCT from here on out, which manipulates the pH of the filtrate by exchanging hydrogen ions, which are acidic, in the interstitium, which is the tissue outside of the tubules, for bicarbonate ions in the filtrate. So switching out acid for base changes the pH of the filtrate. Also secretes organic acids into the filtrate. This is then reabsorbed into the filtrate is then reabsorbed into the peritubular capillaries. When I say convoluted, it is not convoluted in 2 dimensions. It is convoluted in 3 dimensions. So this thing is all kinds of corkscrew shaped. Yeah. The approximate reabsorption rate of different materials in this component, a lot of the filtering is done here in terms of your kidney function. 2/3 of salt and water from the filtrate. About 100% of organic solutes like glucose and amino acids, around 65% of the potassium, approximately 50% of the urea, 80% of the phosphate, and 70 to 90% of the citrate get pulled from the filtrate back to the bloodstream. The loop of Henle is the sort of descending structure from the proximal convoluted tubule and reaches the distal convoluted tubule after that, and its job is to create a concentration gradient in the medulla of the kidney, which I will get into in a little bit. And the distal convoluted tubule, which just like its proximal counterpart is convoluted in 3 dimensions, more reabsorption happens from here, and the concentrated tubule fluid collects at the end. The distal convoluted tubule functions in regulating pH by absorbing bicarbonate and secreting more hydrogen ions into the filtrate, or in reverse, depending on what's going on. Sodium and potassium levels are also manipulated here. So your body does not want to lose valuable materials that it worked hard to get, things like glucose and proteins and all that, and that's why this filtration process is present. The loop of Henle, as we said, drops from the PCT to the DCT. The ascending part of it is only permeable to sodium, potassium, and chlorine ions, and the descending loop is only permeable to water. What this serves to do is that it creates a very salty environment on the outside. Biological systems are really good at actively transporting solutes of various kinds, but not H2O, and so this is the mechanism where your body uses to reclaim water, so that you would not be losing huge amounts of water every single day, which actually your kidney does filter huge amounts of water a day. Yeah, the peritubular capillaries are sort of wrapped around the PCT and DCT in both classes of nephrons. Remember, we have the juxtamedullary and the cortical nephrons. They only surround the loop of Henle in the juxtamedullary nephrons. This is called vasa recta, not in cortical nephrons. And these peritubular capillaries are what allow for filtered material from the tubules to come back to the bloodstream. And the renal tubules that we just referred to drain out in the collecting duct, and the collecting duct also has a bunch of subdivided parts. You have the collecting tubule, the initial collecting tubule, the cortical collecting ducts, the medullary collecting ducts, and the papillary ducts, which then feed into the calyx. So basically the renal tubules drain out and send urine to the ureter, which then goes to the bladder. So the next main structure I want to talk about is actually the ureters themselves. The ureters are made of a combination of different types of tissue. They're approximately 1/3 of a meter, or a foot, for those of you who are still using non-metric. You really should learn metric. In length, they're around 3.5 millimeters in diameter, which is just a little more than 1/10 of an inch, so you can imagine how thin these are. The ureter is made of transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium are stratified cells that can change shape based on the amount of stretch that is applied to them. The smooth muscle itself starts about 1/3 of the way down to assist with peristalsis. Peristalsis, you may remember, is sort of smooth muscular contractions. They are generally involuntary. They're completely involuntary, sorry. And that moves fluid or some other material through the body. The ureters arise from the pelvis of each kidney, and they go down on top of the psoas major muscle. The psoas major, for those of you who don't know, branches from the lumbar spine down to the medial side of the femur, around the beginning of the neck, before crossing in front of the common iliac arteries. Remember, the iliac arteries are the arteries that run through the hip, and finally curve forward to enter the bladder from its posterior face on either side. So, from your kidneys, the urine goes into the ureters to the bladder, and we're going to talk about the urinary bladder right now. The urinary bladder is its entire job is to hold urine until excretion is opportune, until urination is opportune. It is a hollow, muscular, distensible, meaning elastic, organ, and it sits on the pelvic floor. Its approximate capacity is 400 milliliters, so that's about 2 cups, and the top of it is called the fundus. The two ureteric orifices is where the ureters feed into the bladder, and the opening of the urethra surrounds the trigon of the bladder. Yes, there is part of your bladder called the trigon. It is also known as the vesical trigon. It is a triangular region of the bladder formed by the two orifices and the internal urethral opening. Has a lot of stretch receptors, and once a certain amount of stretch is experienced in the bladder, then you get the urge to urinate. Also, a small clinical note: infections tend to persist in the bladder. In biological males, the prostate gland is on the outside of the opening for the urethra, so it sits kind of right under the bladder, and the bladder is in front of the rectum in males and in front of the uterus in biological females. Also, a side note to clear up any confusion: the bladder does not make mucus, does not produce mucus on its inside. This is one of the reasons it's vulnerable to infection. Remember that mucus serves to trap pathogens and move them out. Another fun fact: the destrusor muscle of the bladder wall. It's a spiral of smooth muscle, and when the bladder is stretched, the parasympathetic nervous system signals it to contract to void the bladder. So actually holding your urine in is a sort of, it's not a fight, but it's a tension between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. This is why peeing when you're nervous is difficult, among other things. And yeah, a meta-analysis of positioning showed that it contracts more easily when seated. It is therefore it's easier if you have prostate problems, prostate inflammation, to if you're male, to urinate sitting down. Also, no one has actually checked to see if males have larger bladders, though it is assumed. And it's possible that the reasons that females, generally speaking, this is sort of anecdotally something a lot of people have experienced, that females have the urge to go to the bathroom more often than males is because the urinary bladder is directly in front of the uterus. So there's literally more organs that it pushes up against. In terms of other little small pieces of vocabulary you need to know, the rugae are ridges formed by the walls of any organ. They're present in the gallbladder, vagina, stomach, scrotum in biological males, and the hard palate behind the upper anterior teeth, and, of course, the urinary bladder. So the rugae are these sort of protrusions on the tissue, sort of similar to villi, but more of a macro structure. There are also a couple of things which my prof wants us to know. There is vesicoureteral reflux. This is also called retrograde urination. And this is flow from the bladder back up the ureter or the kidney. So urine goes back where it came from, essentially. And this is a dysfunction of the uterovesical one-way valve. That is the valve on either of the urinary orifices that leads from the ureter into the bladder. In children, it's generally asymptomatic, but it does increase the risk of urinary tract infection. A lower urinary tract infection or an infection of the bladder is called cystitis, and an upper urinary tract infection in the kidney is called pyelonephritis. The vesical venous plexus is the drainage, the blood drainage of deoxygenated blood from the lower bladder and the base of the prostate in biological males, and it drains into the internal iliac by way of a number of small veins. The vesical arteries that supply oxygen-rich blood to the bladder and the terminal end of the ureter, there are two that are prominent. Their numbers are very variable, actually, but there are two that are prominent, and that is the superior and inferior vesical arteries. The superior branches off from the umbilical artery, and the inferior branches off from the iliac artery. Moving from the urinary bladder, we've got the internal urethral orifice. This is the opening of the bladder into the urethra. This is located at the apex, the end of the trigon, the most dependent. Dependent in anatomy means the lowest part of the bladder. The internal urethral orifice is generally crescent-shaped. In biological males, it is slightly elevated because of the mucous membrane called the uvula vesica that it sits on, which is in the middle of the lobe of the prostate, middle lobe of the prostate. The uvula vesica, that elevates it. It consists of a ring of smooth muscle, essentially, and the internal sphincter of the urethra consists of a ring of smooth muscle, and this is kept under voluntary control by the lumbar plexus of the sympathetic nervous system. Again, I recommend looking at an atlas to see where this is. This relaxes during urination, and it also contracts during ejaculation in males to prevent the reflux of semen back into the bladder. Fun fact, periuresis is called it's this name for the sensation or the phenomenon of not being able to urinate while being watched. Again, we talked about that urination is actually a parasympathetic process. It's within your control, but it's a parasympathetic process. And when you're nervous, that means the sympathetic nervous system is engaged. So if you are nervous, you will have trouble urinating. The urethra, which I mentioned when I was talking about the bladder, is what connects the urinary bladder to the urinary meatus, which is also called the external urinary orifice. This is where urination actually happens. In the males, this is the glans penis, and in females, this is the vulval vestibule, and it is closed off by the external urethral sphincter. In biological males, it has 4 regions: the preprostatic, the prostatic, the membranous, and the spongy. An easy way to remember this is PPMS. Those of you who aren't familiar with PMS, I encourage you to go learn about the reproductive system or have some female friends. The preprostatic bit of the urethra, the beginning of it, is about a centimeter or about 0.4 inches in length, and it is made of transitional epithelium. Remember, we said that is cells that can sort of change shape based on stretch or some other mechanical stimulus. The prostatic section crosses the prostate, and it has several openings. These openings are called verumontanum, which also incidentally sounds like a true spell from Harry Potter. These openings are for the ejaculatory duct, the prostatic ducts, and the prostatic utricle, which is just an indentation. Hopefully I'll be going over this in an episode about the reproductive system in more detail. The membranous end of the urethra is about 1.5 centimeters long, and it passes through the external urethral sphincter. The Cowper's gland in biological males is behind here, but it only opens in the spongy urethra. This is pseudostratified, columnar tissue. Okay, so pseudostratified means it's not really stratified. It only appears that way because of the shape of the cells. It's columnar, meaning these are sort of long, tall cells, relatively speaking. And the spongy urethra or penile urethra in biological males is about 15.5 centimeters or 6 inches long, and it is on the ventral side of the penis, the underside of the penis, and travels through the corpus spongiosum, which is the spongy tissue of the penis, and it runs parallel to the meatus until the end, where it basically curves upwards. It goes vertical. What this does is result in a spiral stream that cleans the actual meatus itself. This is the supposed reason why females are more likely to get a UTI, a urinary tract infection, because in biological females this does not happen. It's a straight stream. So the proximal end of the spongy urethra is pseudostratified columnar, just like the membranous region, and then sort of more distally it becomes stratified squamous tissue. And some muscles around this area and various parts which my prof wants me to know. The levator ani is the main pelvic floor muscle that contracts during orgasm and during Kegel work, for those of you who know what that is. If not, feel free to Google it. I am not going to explain it here. And this is located on either side of the pelvis. Fun fact, tail wagging in quadrupedal animals is caused by this muscle. In humans, it is a good deal weaker, because we do not have to wag our tails. We don't have tails anymore. In females, the labia minora, also called the inner labia or lips, it's also called the vaginal lips, it's also called the nymphae, are 2 flaps of skin on either side of the vagina. They are situated between the labia majora, which are the larger vaginal lips. the labia minora function to provide protection to the vulvar vestibule, which is the inner part of the vagina, and contribute to sexual stimulation. They also have a mucus, sort of gland mucus tissue that provides a certain amount of lubrication. I will probably be going over that in more detail in another episode. The urogenital diaphragm is also one of the vocabulary terms that my prof wants me to know. I did a little bit of reading about it. It's not really there. A lot of researchers claim that it's there and it's used as a sort of anatomical landmark, but it's often used to describe the muscular parts of the deep perineal pouch. The urethra and the vagina pass through here, but it's not to be confused with the pelvic diaphragm, which consists of the levator ani, the coccygeus muscle, and the connective tissue that is in the area around the pelvis. Don't worry too much about the urogenital diaphragm. I don't think that it is going to be on many people's exams. And that about covers the macro structure of the urinary tract. I really recommend looking at an atlas for this one. It's not too complicated, but that covers us in terms of that. Now I would like to get into some relevant hormones and other molecules and cells and stuff like that is relevant here. So in the endocrine system, I talked about aldosterone. Aldosterone in the renal system, well, I'll just go over aldosterone and then we'll get into what it actually does. Aldosterone is a steroid hormone, so remember that is a lipidus hormone. It's made in the adrenal glands, and what it does is, throughout the body, raises blood pressure and lowers blood potassium levels. And the way it does this is by manipulating the principal functional cells of the kidney. It's made from cholesterol, so without cholesterol you cannot form aldosterone, but the body makes its own cholesterol, so you don't really need to worry about that unless you have some kind of rare genetic condition. Its triggers for production are too much potassium, so if your system is flooded with potassium, your body will make aldosterone. And what it does is it affects the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. And it makes the sodium-potassium pump on the basolateral surface, which is the blood to principal cell surface in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct, work harder. So more sodium and potassium are pumped out of the filtrate and into the blood. So more sodium comes out, and therefore more water goes out into the blood. Remember, water will try to create osmotic balance with the filtrate. There is another hormone which I want to get into, which is called atrial natriuretic peptide, okay, which is a peptide hormone, as you can imagine. It's also called atrial natriuretic factor or atrial natriuretic hormone, cardioatrine or cardiodilatin or atriopeptin, and it is a protein hormone secreted by cardiac muscle cells. It's a very strong vasodilator, and it has a lot of effects, but I'm not going to get into all of them today. I'm just going to talk about what it does in the kidneys. Atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, dilates the afferent glomerular arteriole. So remember we said that is the arteriole that feeds into the glomerulus in the nephrons, and it constricts the efferent glomerular arteriole, relaxes the mesangial cells. Remember we said that when those contract, they can change the amount of filtrate that goes through the glomerulus. And what this does is result in higher pressure in the glomerular capillaries and therefore higher flow rate. So the mesangial cells relax, more pressure in the glomerular capillaries, more flow rate. More flow rate means a higher load of sodium and H2O are filtered out into the filtrate, and that will serve to lower blood pressure. Sorry, raise blood pressure. Lower blood pressure. It basically functions in reverse of aldosterone. So, atrial natriuretic peptide, reverse of aldosterone, lowers blood pressure. Okay, it increases also blood flow through the vasorecta. Remember we said those are the peritubular capillaries that wrap around the loop of Henle in juxtamedullary nephrons. And this washes more sodium and urea out of the medullary interstitium, which results in less reabsorption into the tubular fluid and increased excretion of sodium and urea. Okay, so it makes your urine stronger, literally. Decreases sodium reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule and the cortical collecting duct. It also inhibits renin secretion, which inhibits the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, which I will talk about in a bit, the net effect is less sodium in the blood and a lower blood pressure. Okay. Some special cell structures, the and special structures in general, juxtaglomerular apparatus, which is, I'm going to call it the JGA for short, is next to the glomerulus. It contains juxtaglomerular cells that make renin. Okay, I'll get into renin in just a sec. We also have the macula densa. The macula densa are specialized cells that monitor the concentration of sodium chloride in the blood. If the concentration gets too high, then they send a signal that has a couple of effects. One is they decrease resistance in the afferent arterioles, which raises glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which, as we said, results in more filtrate. So it pulls, in the end, more sodium gets pulled out of the blood. This makes a lot of sense. And it increases renin release from the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Now, what the heck is renin? Renin, it's a really interesting little signal here. It's the lead agent in the renin-angiotensin system. Renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or ROS for short. What renin does, it's an enzyme, and it cleaves angiotensinogen, which is made in the liver. It cleaves it into two pieces, and one of those pieces is angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 then travels up to and gets converted by ACE. ACE is angiotensin converting enzyme, which is made in the lungs. And that conversion process also happens in pulmonary tissue, in the lung tissue. And this makes angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 constricts blood vessels. It increases antidiuretic hormone production. It also increases aldosterone production. It stimulates the hypothalamus to activate thirst. So the net effect of renin is that it increases blood pressure, and it's important for kidney function. I was looking for answers as to why angiotensin converting enzyme is made in the lungs, and I did not find anything especially satisfactory. If anybody has a good reference for that, let me know. That's about it in terms of the urinary and renal system. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Feel free to download this from SoundCloud, carry it around with you, listen to it, study anywhere you need to. You also can like this video on YouTube. You can subscribe to my channel. I will be making more things like this if you like these long-form reviews of various subjects. I'll be focusing on anatomy for first-year paramedical students. So, yeah, that's it. Happy studying, people, and good luck.